Investors set to receive $36 billion in dividends in coming weeks. COVID cases across the nation surge, and the United States votes to make daylight saving permanent. It's Thursday, the 17th of March, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to you, Michael. Anyone named Sean takes note of St. Patrick's Day. I certainly grew up in a household where we celebrated fairly vigorously. I'd say as a child, I didn't so much, but my parents certainly did.
And I imagine those celebrations would now continue for you as an adult. St. Patrick's Day celebrations are a particular type of celebration, aren't they? They're usually full of vigour.
Yeah, full of vigour. That's it. Nowadays, I try and avoid them. I think they're a little too dangerous for a man of my standing and age.
Oh, that sounds very, very wise, Sean. And immediately after the show, stay listening for Sean's chat to Cara Morton, the boss of travel insurance group Covermore. Really interesting conversation, that one. We'll have a bit of a chat about that later. But first, Sean, investors will receive $36 billion in dividends in coming weeks, nearly 40% more than a year earlier, as some of Australia's largest companies share the spoils with shareholders.
That's right, Michael. Around $4.3 billion has already been paid out, but dividends now start to ramp up. In fact, the week after next, about $20 billion in dividends are due to be doled out. It's great news for investors, many of whom, of course, rely on the income, particularly pensioners. After a broad cessation of dividends by many companies during COVID, they are well and truly back. Now, dividends are a really important part of the investment landscape. Australia pays relatively high dividends, in part because they're tax advantaged. The dividend yield in Australia is about 4.3%, much higher than Europe or the US. In fact, according to CommSec, since 2004, the share market has almost doubled in value. That's the capital return. But total returns, which includes all the payouts, have almost quadrupled. Incredible, that. Think of that another way. $36 billion is being paid to shareholders in dividends these few weeks, while the value of the S&P 500 fell more than 5%. There's the value of dividends there. 4 and 5 of the companies on the S&P ASX 200 that reported a December half result will pay a dividend. Some companies, such as airlines, gaming groups, travel companies, they're not quite in a position to issue a dividend yet. About half of all companies increased dividends, while just 18% cut dividends. BHP's a big one. It'll pay out $10 billion in dividends on March 28. That includes a big special dividend. That came after recording a massive profit thanks to record iron ore prices. Fortescue Group and Rio Tinto also joined the party. They'll pay out $2.6 billion and $2.1 billion respectively. Commonwealth Bank will pay out nearly $3 billion. Helping these massive payouts is that 88% of the companies that reported for the December half made money. That's the most since the pandemic began and about in line with the long-term average.
So, Sean, what do investors tend to do with the money then that they receive from these dividend payments?
Well, it lands in your bank account and you basically save it or spend it or invest it. Now, it helps many people who have had a rough ride, particularly people in flood areas, and they'll really appreciate the cash, no doubt about it. So too pensioners. It could actually trigger a mini retail boom in the next month or so, just because so much in dividends are being paid out. Other investors, of course, will reinvest it, and thanks to the joys of compound interest, reinvesting your money is a great way of saving for the future.
All right, how did the local equity market finish yesterday, Sean?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 jumped 1.1% to finish at 7,175 points. Around 3/4 of companies on the ASX 200 rose, led by the technology stocks, online property group REA, employment company Seek, and accounting software giant Xero all jumped 4%. Software group WiseTech rose nearly 5%. Michael, the run of the banks continued, with ANZ and Macquarie Group both up nearly 2% and Commonwealth Bank and Westpac rising around 1%. Aristocrat Leisure rose more than 4%, while Woolies was up 3%. The big miners, however, that's BHP, Rio Tinto and Fortescue Metals, all underperformed on the back of a lower iron ore price.
And Sean, of course, global markets are very keen on knowing the Federal Reserve's decision on interest rates, which is due out this morning. Is that right?
That's right. It's probably due out about half an hour after we record this. It will certainly set the tone for rate rises for the rest of the year. Inflation in the world's biggest economy is at a 40-year high. We know that. It could go higher. Now, critics of the central bank argue it's pretty much lost control of prices in the economy. We'll wait and see what it has to say on that. Now, some commodity prices, notably oil, are looking just a touch more sensible at the moment. Brent crude is trading back below $100 a barrel amid rumours that Iran nuclear talks may resume. Oil prices are now down about 20% over the past week. Let's hope it gets to the petrol bowser at some point.
Sean, this morning you have given me a masterclass in dividends. Unfortunately, I'm a terrible investor, so I won't be receiving any, which is why we actually tell people always see a financial advisor.
That's right. That's right.
Good advice. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was talking pretty tough on China yesterday. He was calling on the superpower to be transparent about the nature of its relationship with Russia and particularly military support.
Yes, the Prime Minister yesterday said, and I quote, "One thing that has disturbed me from the outset, apart from the obvious in terms of Russia's violent and illegal invasion of Ukraine, has been the chilling silence that we saw from China." Now, Michael, I'm not sure that he should really equate the human tragedy in Ukraine with Beijing's silence, but I suppose there is an election coming up. Anyway, Mr. Morrison called on China to be transparent about the economic and military ties between Moscow and Beijing, and said Australia will act in lockstep with the US and other allies in imposing sanctions on China if Beijing comes to Russia's rescue. Meanwhile, the Federal Labor Party has affirmed its commitment to the US alliance, with opposition defence spokesperson Brendan O'Connor saying it was critical to underpin peace, stability and freedom in the region.
Sean, there's some really tasteless politicking going on around the tragic death last week of Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching.
Yes, Michael, I think this is politics at its absolute worst. Senator Kitching died last week of a heart attack. Reports in the Australian newspaper claimed that a Mean Girls, MEAN, Mean Girls trio in Labor's Senate team involving Senators Penny Wong, Katie Gallagher and Christina Keneally put strain on Ms Kitching ahead of her death. Labor leader Anthony Albanese dismissed the claims. Now, there were reports that the story did come out of the Labor movement. They're unconfirmed. The Prime Minister said the claims were very distressing and shouldn't be dismissed. He then described Senator Kitching as a true patriot. Let's face it, he wouldn't have said that if she were in the Senate today. Poor form all round.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sean, I mentioned at the top of the show that there are big numbers at the moment on the COVID front across many states. COVID's really returning to the front pages.
Unfortunately, you're right. The number of cases in New South Wales, 30,400 yesterday, was huge, but did reflect an underreporting glitch of about 10,000. Still, 20,000 cases is the most in a 24-hour period in several weeks in that state. New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard said the sub-variant of Omicron was taking over in the state and was more transmissible than previous variants. But the good news is the outcomes were no more severe. In Victoria, the sub-variant is also on the rise and case numbers are expected to increase in March and April as people spend more time indoors. The state recorded 9,400 cases yesterday. That's the highest in more than a month. Queensland announced 6,100 infections and 3 deaths. Western Australia recorded 6,000 cases. South Australia was at 3,100 and Tasmania's case numbers were nearly 1,900. That's the second highest for Tassie since the pandemic began. It's all bad news.
And Sean, just quickly before we leave COVID, I was blown away by some of the statistics released by the ABS that show that almost half of all Australians have taken a COVID test in the past 4 weeks. That is a lot of people, and it's really just changed our lives, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I totally agree. I was really surprised just how many people have taken tests, and it really shows how prevalent COVID is in our everyday lives now. 47%, in fact, of all Australians have done a test in that last 4 weeks. 17% said someone in their household had tested positive. Around 1/4 of people have had their jobs affected by the coronavirus, and people were now more likely to take precautions against COVID, even though many restrictions have been dropped, than they were back in the middle of last year. COVID really is now of everyone's everyday life.
Yeah, remember how when it first started and to go and do a PCR test was almost a little bit of a novelty. Like, oh, you'd tell your friends, hey, I went for a PCR test, and everyone would be like, oh, how was it? Now you just do it without even blinking, and everyone in your whole household does it. And it is absolutely part of everyday life. And 2 years ago, if you were to say that,
no one would believe you.
It's amazing how much things have changed.
Yeah, I don't even read the instructions on rats tests anymore.
No.
That's how often I do them.
And we know that you are very instructions focused.
I am very instruction focused. That's true.
Except on St. Patrick's Day. Now, Sean, borders are obviously reopening. We heard yesterday about cruise ships that will soon be allowed back. Are people travelling overseas? And are overseas travellers coming to Australia, really?
Well, they are. The last 3 months has seen a really big pickup in departures and arrivals, though nothing like pre-COVID times. In fact, departures are about 10% of normal numbers. Now, Michael, where do you think people are travelling to, at least for holidays?
Oh, I can't imagine they're going far. I would have said New Zealand, but it's not the easiest place to get to at any point.
That
But I
doesn't
would
make
say
the grade.
I would have said Fiji, probably. That's where I want to go.
Yeah, Fiji. Did I mention I'm going in a week's time?
I'm going too,
Good
not in
reason.
a week's time, but I'm going in about 6 months' time. Booked it this week, doing my bit for the economy.
There you go.
Fiji's economy, that is.
Fiji's, yeah. Well, Fiji's the number one destination, followed by the USA and India. Now, in terms of arrivals, there was a surge in December last year, then more in January, and even more in February. Where do you think the visitors are coming from? Part 2.
I would say the US.
Yes, well, that's the top 3. It's third. The UK, number 1, then India, and then the US.
Oh, really? Oh, there you go. Do you just want to mention one more time that you're going to Fiji in a week?
Yeah.
It feels like you've been rubbing that in for some time now.
Yeah. In the next fortnight, I will be one of those numbers.
Oh, fantastic. Good on you. A couple of other smaller stories around, Sean, that are worth mentioning. Suncorp has upped its estimate of the natural hazard costs on the insurer for the financial year to a casual $1.1 billion.
Yes. Not bad, is it? That's on the back of the floods and storms in New South Wales and Queensland, of course. The group has received more than 34,000 flood claims, of which about 60% are from Queensland.
And Sean, Australians are more than twice as likely to fall victim to mobile phone scams than the rest of the world. That's pretty high.
Yeah, I'm almost relieved about this because I get dodgy messages literally every day. A US-based group, Zimperium, has detected more than 2 million new mobile malware samples over the past year. That's according to The Australian. Add to that, ratings agency Fitch said cyber attacks on businesses and government agencies globally have surged following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we are in the midst of an explosion in scams.
The worst one seems to be, or the most prevalent one seems to be, here's an update on the tracking on your package.
Yes, I get a couple of those a day.
Yeah, and look, I've never clicked on them personally.
But someone like you who buys online all the time, Michael, see, I don't buy that much online, and if I do, I'm sort of aware of it. But if you buy a lot online, it'd be very tempting to click on it.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you have to actually make a conscious effort to go, actually, that is not legitimate. And so I'm not surprised at all that Aussies are more than twice as likely to fall victim to these scams because they are just so prevalent.
Sure are.
All right, Sean, moving on to overseas news. I mentioned New Zealand a few minutes ago. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern yesterday lifted quarantine for Australians travelling across the ditch from April 12.
Yes, very exciting. Didn't the local travel stocks like it? Qantas' share price jumped more than 2% yesterday. Corporate travel was up nearly 6%. Webjet was up 3%. Qantas and Jetstar immediately put on up to 30 return flights per week. That's up from 2 flights currently. Mind you, pre-COVID, that was about 170 return flights. New South Wales has also lifted restrictions for visitors from the US, UK, Japan, Singapore and Germany. They all kick in from 1 May. Good news for the travel sector in New Zealand.
Sean, this story is bizarre. I thought it was fantastic at first, but now the more I think about it, it is a bit odd.
It is bizarre.
The US Senate has passed legislation that would make daylight saving time permanent from late next year. So this is not just they're always going to do it for 6 months of the year. They're going to do it for 12 months of the year. Is that right?
That's right. The whole country would move forward 1 hour and just never change back. The funny thing, supporters say will help with brighter afternoons and more economic activity. It'll allow children to play outdoors later, reduce seasonal depression. It still has to pass the House of Representatives before heading to President Joe Biden's desk. I just loved some of the key interest groups involved that the politicians were talking about. They had to talk to the airlines about it. They had to talk to the broadcasters, presumably sports rights or something like that. The National Association of Convenience Stores, for example, opposed the idea because it didn't want kids going to school in the dark. And the House Energy and Commerce Committee chair said the loss of 1 hour's sleep impacts people for days and wreaks havoc on kids and pets. I actually have no idea whether the chair is for or against the change because it just made no sense to me. It's worth it, Michael. Google it because this is a really funny story. Some of the arguments are just hilarious. It's kind of like Queensland 40 years ago. Remember under Joe Bjelke-Petersen and Flo Bjelke-Petersen, and one of the arguments Flo Bjelke-Petersen made against going to daylight saving, and Queensland never has, is because it would fade the curtains more.
Outstanding. Which
Yeah.
is
Some of the arguments on this one are about the equivalent of that.
You know, I would just be happy with Queensland coming in line with the rest of the eastern states and adopting daylight saving for 6 months of the year. Because at the moment, the situation that we have in Australia is just farcical. I don't think we need to go quite as far as the US and have year-round daylight saving. That might be a little bit extreme, but let's just get Queensland in line with New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT. What do you reckon? Are you with me?
I'm with you, but good luck. Got no chance.
Yeah, no chance. All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Cara Morton, the boss of travel insurance group Covermore. Speaking of your trip to Fiji, Sean.
Nice segue. Yes, it was very good timing because, of course, with borders reopening, people are looking for travel insurance. She talks about how travel insurance has really changed throughout the pandemic and it's made people a lot more aware of it. And so the future of travel insurance and for the businesses running travel insurance is actually pretty bright, because suddenly people are thinking a lot more about it. Where went into COVID insurance, how to get it, how it's all priced, that type of stuff. Really interesting interview.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
Enjoy St. Patrick's Day, Thursday, the 17th of March, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us, of course, online on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.